Are you ready to think beyond the accepted social paradigms? Are you ready to expand your thinking and see what others are afraid to accept? Is your perception of reality as fluid as thought, or set hard as stone? Today, on the Mind's Eye podcast, join host James Caiden and his special guest, Clint Heacock, as they discuss the topic of evangelicalism. Is it a divine truth, or just another man-made religion?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the debut episode of the Mind's Eye podcast. I'm your host, James Caiden. And today we are not going to waste any time in launching out into the deep waters when it comes to conversation topics and subject matter. On today's podcast, we will be discussing evangelical Christianity. Is it a divine truth, or simply another man-made religion? This is going to be a two-part series, and I want to put a verbal warning right up front that some of the subject matter might not be easy for some people to hear or accept. But I would encourage everyone listening to these next couple of shows to please do your own research and confirm these things for yourself. Across the world, there are many people that follow one form or another of Christianity. And many of those forms of Christianity or denominations have adopted in one way or another certain belief systems and doctrines of the evangelical community. And many people think that those doctrines and those ideas are indisputable, undeniable truths. But the question we're asking here is, are they really? A word we hear a lot today is the word agenda. Everyone has an agenda, but the place most people don't look when it comes to individuals or organizations having an agenda is at our religious leaders, the religious organizations. We trust what we're being told, at least most people do, or many people do, and we're unaware of the origin of some of these doctrines and the agendas and the political pandering that some of these people do. And then actually why they do it. Here in the United States, we see this rally around Donald Trump from the evangelical community, and most of us don't even ask, why are they doing that? Is Donald Trump really this servant of God sent to make America great again? Or is there something else going on behind the scenes that probably 98% of the people are completely oblivious to? So we're going to get into all of this and more. And here to help me do that is Mr. Clint Heacock. Clint, I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me on the show today. Welcome to the Mind's Eye.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, I think this is going to be awesome. So tell the folks out there a little about yourself, what your background is, and why you're here today to share your expertise in this particular subject.
Okay, like you mentioned, I'm a former evangelical. I was a senior pastor of a church in Portland, Oregon for about 12 years while I was going to Bible college and seminary there. And then I moved over here to the UK about 15 years ago now to do a PhD in biblical studies and homiletics, which is preaching. And then I taught at a Bible college over here in Leeds and Liverpool for about another 8 years and then kind of walked away from the whole thing. So that's been my journey for the last probably 8 or 10 years. I've been working my way out. So my background is basically in academics and theology, biblical studies, all that kind of stuff. For about 20 years, I've been doing that my whole adult life, really, and it's been
Hmm.
a long journey for sure. But I've been doing this podcast called the Mind Shift Podcast for about 4 years now, and I've done a lot of stuff on cults, cult psychology, and now the last year I've been focusing on the Christian right, dominion theology, all that stuff. I'm sure we'll get into really the dangers of what's going on, not just in America today, but really around the world.
It is. It's very concerning, and
Hmm.
people, who listen to my show. I've been podcasting now for, probably over 3 years or so. And this is something that I've always mentioned. I'm not one to come on and say, you're a fool for believing what you believe. But, I think it's both spiritually and psychologically damaging, some of the things that, these religions teach people and indoctrinate them with.
Hmm.
That they're almost like, as we've had banter on Skype back and forth, in the commenting on posts. It's
Hmm.
it's like so many people belong to a cult. They have the same rhetoric, they have that kind of empty look in their eye, and you just can't reach them, you can't reason with them, you can't have a conversation with them. It turns very ugly, very strange. And I for one, I feel very bad for people that are in that kind of situation, because I was there. I wasn't quite as I always say, the glossy-eyed cult member, of
Hmm.
evangelical
Yeah.
Christianity. But I certainly know what it's like to have a spiritual path that is so devoid of the peace and the love, and everything is, so dark. It's the devil and the people who don't believe like you believe in the end of the world and all this crazy stuff. It definitely, which is something we'll talk about a little bit in this show as
Hmm.
well, is the post-traumatic stress syndrome you have when you come out of that. You feel like you're a turtle out of the shell for a minute, going,
Hmm.
holy cow, am I going to hell? Did I do the right thing? Am I losing my mind? What's,
Yeah,
what's the deal with reality here?
it's true.
But
Well, one example is someone said it's like getting out of prison. The rest of the world has moved on while you've been stuck in this psychological prison, in this religion or a cult or whatever your experience was. And it's like the person walking out of that jail cell, and they've got to then readjust to the real world again, especially if you were not a believer before you joined the religion and then left it. In my case, it was different because I was raised in it. So I was born into Christianity from day one. Literally, I believed everything was true. My parents said it was true. The pastor said it was true, and so I was exposed to a lot of what we call religious trauma syndrome, the things you just were talking about as a young
mhm.
child, the fear of hell, the fear of missing the rapture, and all those things within evangelicalism. That's deeply traumatic, especially to a child. So it does a huge amount of damage that you've got to then work through as an adult.
Yeah, and so tell us what caused you to ultimately say, you were walking away from this. You came to the conclusion, after everything that you've done, uh, Bible college, being a pastor. What brought you to the conclusion to say, I don't feel that this is true anymore. I don't feel that this is right. I'm walking away and taking my chances.
Well, it was a long journey. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It took years to work my way out. I think I mentioned that earlier, that it took a long time. I think a lot of it started with my role as a pastor because I was burning out. I didn't realize it at the time, but I see now I was utterly burned out when I was pastoring this church in Portland. And I was suffering a lot of distress and trauma just from being in that leadership role. It's a very thankless, exhausting job, as most pastors will tell you. It's very tiring emotionally, physically, spiritually. It's draining. And so part of us getting out of the States and coming over here was to kind of start a new life anyway. I mean, I was still very much involved in the church. I wanted to be a Bible college teacher. That's why I did a PhD. I was going to get back into academics. And my thought at the time was, I want to do this degree because as a teacher, I'll be able to influence new generations of ministry leaders coming up. And so I thought I'll
Hmm.
pass my wisdom, my experiences along, what it was really like to be in the trenches for 10 or 12 years as a church leader, as a pastor, as an elder, a youth pastor. I'd done all those things. But in that process of really studying the sort of theological academic side, I started having more and more questions that I was not finding answers to. So part of it was deconstructing my relationship with the church, but the other half of it was the sort of theological worldview piece that wasn't making sense as much anymore. And then what was happening was with my students, I was bringing up a lot of my own issues that I was working through, and that was causing a lot of existential sort of threats in their mind, because they're like, "Whoa,
Right.
this guy, who he's supposed to be teaching at a Bible college, is he even a Christian or what? He's making us question all these things." And so I realized that they did me a favor in the end, that they laid me off basically because this college ran out of money, which was the best thing that's ever happened to me. Really, I was really having a harder and harder time, sort of maintaining the party line. So I ended up getting made redundant, which is what they say here in the UK, but it's being laid off. And I've never looked back. I've never gone back into academics, at least in that regard, teaching, Bible theology and all that. So it was a long journey. It took about 10 years to get out.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It wasn't overnight for me either. I probably started about 1993, 94,
Hmm.
and I didn't fully pull the plug until the year 2000. But it
Hmm.
was it was hard. It was definitely hard.
It is.
I I had that spring and that summer of 2000 tremendous like anxiety, talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome. I was thinking to myself, I just kind of walked away from and said, that's it for a path that I followed for years. It's like you said, pretty much all your life.
Sure. It's your whole
And
identity.
yeah, I mean, I was
Really is.
dreaming about it. I was waking up literally in the cold sweats. You
Yeah.
don't realize, and that's not me. I'm not that kind of person to get all rattled over, you know, uh,
There's some
doctrinal
beliefs.
difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was surprised myself. Like, man, I'm really going through some stuff here.
Yeah.
This is traumatic. I look back and I say, geez, I was fortunate that I made it through that valley
Mm.
without needing, pills or counseling, but
Some people don't
it
make it.
took, yeah,
They really don't.
I
I
know
mean,
people,
it's true.
I know, I know people that are still on that path. They're still asking the questions. They're still in anxiety land for,
Hmm.
years now, years and years.
Well, and
And
that's one of
it's,
the pieces about it is you've got to process on the back end. There's a woman, Dr. Marlene Winnell. I've had her on my podcast. She sort of wrote the book on religious trauma syndrome, and she talks about RTS. It's a double whammy because on the one hand, you're experiencing the trauma within the religion, like you were talking about the fear of hell and all these other doctrines that they lay on us. So you're being sort of abused spiritually, emotionally, maybe even sexually in some cases within the system. And then when you leave it, you've got to process all the grief, the anger, the loss, the betrayal, the trauma that you
mhm.
experience while you're in it. So it's a double whammy, and people have to sort of look at it from a step back and look at it objectively and say, well, there's at least two elements to this whole piece of dealing with RTS, and you might need therapy or counseling to process this stuff.
So what were some of the things, so folks listening get a little bit of a better grasp? What were some of the things that you were questioning that made you say, I don't know about this worldview anymore?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I think a lot of it was, I see it now. I was questioning the dogma that I was raised in, the sort of fundamentalist version of Christianity. So when I went off to Bible college and then seminary, the more I got into academics, studying church history and theology, I began to see right away that there were many, many, many different traditions within Christianity. So I was only representing a very small segment of the whole picture, as it were. So that right there sort of opened my eyes to the reality that, wait a minute, I was being told all the time as a kid that we had the corner on the truth, capital T truth. Then I come to find
Hmm.
out, wait a minute, first of all, there's loads of different denominations. There's all kinds of different traditions, everywhere from Eastern Orthodox to Roman Catholic to Lutheran to Presbyterian to Charismatic, Baptist, you name it. Thousands and thousands of denominations and traditions. Who's to say which one of them is correct? Because they all think that, they're right. So
All
that
right.
kind of rattled me a lot. And so I was going on this journey to try to find what was sort of the true religion and go back to something sort of a New Testament spirituality or whatever. But there's a lot of issues with that. And the more I studied the Bible, for my PhD anyway, I began to realize that there was all kinds of problems with the text of the Bible itself, as far as transmission, translations, textual criticism. I mean, it's just a whole can of worms there. So that really did me in, as far as viewing the Bible as inerrant, without mistakes and all that. So there was a lot of different things that started. It was like the death of a thousand cuts. It wasn't one big thing, but it was all these little things that added up.
Right. Yeah, I had a similar path, toward the end, looking into uh Christian history, what did the ancient Christians believe? And as
Hmm.
I talk about on this show a little bit, that, especially with the Bible, that becomes a big stumbling block because, and I'm sure as you said, looking back, Christianity was not just one thing at one time. There were many different little groups of Christians,
Oh, absolutely.
you know, and many of them in the beginning believed different things about Jesus. Some said he
Hmm.
was the Son of God. Some said he was, something else. Many
Hmm.
ancient Christians practiced like folk magic, which would be absolutely forbidden,
Hmm.
in this day and age. They did little spells and rituals. It was kind of like a little folk religion to some.
Hmm.
And even the way that they looked at the Bible, they looked at it as being an inspired text written by fallible people, and there were mistakes, there were problems,
Hmm.
and much of it was allegory. Even like Adam and Eve, they looked at it as a story, an allegory. And you
Yeah.
verse that today with the modern evangelical fundamentalist Christian who says the Bible is the infallible, inerrant, literal, God-breathed word of the divine. It's a completely different animal. And
It is absolutely.
you see how people start falling over that and say, well, if this is God's literal word, why is there this problem and that little contradiction and two different sides to this story? One gospel tells it this way, the other tells it that way. The ancients had no problem with that because they said, you know what, it's an inspired text written by fallible people. There's going to be
Hmm.
mistakes. They
Absolutely.
looked at much.
Hmm.
There's even, I think it's the Benedictines, if I'm not mistaken, uh, the monks in the Catholic Church, who they look at the actually in a very old way as being all poetry that has uh, spiritual truth and moral significance.
Hmm.
So they have a very different way of looking at it, as again, going back to the way some of the ancients viewed the text rather than, oh, this is God's literal word for word.
Hmm.
And then, as you said, translation. I mean, the Catholic Church was sadly notorious with their translation. They changed a lot of things and added things in to fit their doctrines. And
Hmm.
they also killed off a lot of those early folk Christians that we
They
have no
did.
record of, because convert to our way or die. So those very
Absolutely.
early Christians, they're gone. We
They're gone.
have very little that we know about them.
Yeah,
So
and
big problem.
the only thing we know about them is what the Catholic Church ended up preserving, quote unquote, in their history, their version of it. For example, the Cathars is one of my favorite examples in southern France. Around about 1244, they wiped them out, and they were supposedly heretics. But the only thing we know about the Cathars is what the Catholic Church told us they believed, which is that they were heretics. But because they burned and trashed all their writings, so we don't even know what they actually believe,
Hmm.
but they were a quote heretical sect, So a lot of this is it's reactionary. I remember one of the things that Dr. Stanley Grenz, he was a Canadian theologian, he said that really stuck with me. He said that all theology is historically and culturally conditioned. In other words,
Hmm.
if you look at the doctrines that have been set in place over the millennia, really by the church, every one of them is basically a reaction to something or someone. Like you were saying, you go back before the time of Constantine, there was hundreds of different sects going around, Gnostics and all sorts of things, but they stamped that all out when Constantine made Christianity the official state religion of Rome with the Nicene Creed and all that. They said, if you don't believe this, you're in, you're out. If you believe it, you're in. and everyone's a heretic if you don't believe it. And so that's kind of been the playbook of the church really ever since, is to be very reactionary, and then they'll draw a line in the sand, and you're either in or you're out. And a lot of times they've been persecuted, murdered, executed, assassinated, martyred, whatever, by the church.
Yeah, and many times they've killed their own people and then turned around and made them saints.
Yeah, that's
So
ironic.
go
Go
figure
figure.
that one.
I know. Later they go, whoops, maybe we got that one wrong, but well, now we'll canonize this person, make him a saint. It doesn't
Put a
help the
Band-Aid
person
on
who
that.
got burned at the stake, though, really, does it?
Yeah, I hear you. But I think that's what happens when I look at what we know of some of the very early Christians. It feels very comfortable to me. Some of it like suits my personality, my belief system, you know.
Yeah.
But then when you wonder what Christianity would be today, if it wasn't taken over by this big conglomerate to uh, you know make it their own,
Hmm. Well, it's
and
all
what
about
they
money
made
and
was
power, isn't it? That's the whole thing. As soon as they made Christianity the state religion of Rome, the Pope kind of became a de facto king of the Roman Empire after it collapsed in the West, So ever since then, in the Western tradition anyway, up until the Reformation, the Catholic Church was the only game in town. They told you what was heresy and what wasn't, and they had the power to send armies and destroy your country if you didn't, sort of agree with their theology. So the Pope had incredible amounts of power, and really the Reformation is just as much a political reaction as it was a theological one too. Because these princes in Germany were they were saying, "Hey, now's our chance to get out from under the thumb of the Pope." So there's all that goes along with what happened, historically.
it is it was absolutely crazy what
Yeah,
they did.
yeah, they
And,
persecuted, the Anabaptists. Both the Lutherans and the Calvinists were persecuting the Anabaptists, so they weren't exactly lily white, saints either. Just because they weren't Catholics doesn't mean they weren't, above barbarism as well. So they got blood on their hands too, just as much as the Catholic Church does.
yeah, and a lot of people don't know either, particularly Protestants. They hail, Martin Luther as, the hero. He
Hmm.
broke away his 95 thesis, but a lot of people don't know about Luther, and I'm sure you know this. He had a lot of regret about his breaking away after there was so much division and
Hmm.
fragmenting
Yeah,
and
wars.
fanaticism, and toward the end of his life, he said if he knew what was going to happen when he broke away from the Catholic Church, he never would have done it. It was like an
Mm.
absolute nightmare.
Yeah. And of course, he was,
And-
anti-Semitic as well, which of course most
mm,
people back then were. I'm not excusing Luther, but I mean, that's another aspect of Luther a lot of people don't know about. He wrote treatises against the Jews and their lies, and so he was
mhm.
not a saint himself either, old Luther.
Yeah, and it's, whatever people may think of Jesus. I mean, I'm cool with Jesus. I'm sure there was a historical Jesus. I think some of the things that we have in the Gospels, they're very interesting and deep teachings, and
Hmm.
it's always incredibly fascinating to me how you can, as some say, read those red letters in the Gospels and then see every religion,
Yeah.
Catholic,
Yeah.
Protestant, evangelical, fundamentalist. They're all doing the things he said not to do,
Yeah. Oh, the
and
irony.
repeating the same dogmas and nonsense as like the
Yeah.
Pharisees that Jesus continued to. And I always say, how do they get away with that one? It's
Yeah.
like, holy cow, Batman, are you serious that you don't actually see what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, they're the
You
ones who
know,
are in charge. That's how they get away with it. They're like you said. If Jesus came down today, let's say we put him in that DeLorean and fast forwarded him to today, I think the people he'd have the biggest problem with are exactly the people you're talking about, the religious establishment, not just in America, of course, but in other countries as well, because they were the ones that were doing the very things that he was railing against in the Gospels, So
Yeah.
nothing's changed really in that regard.
Yeah, they'd probably hang him up on the cross all
Yep,
over again and say, "You're not the
I
real
think they would.
Jesus."
They'd crucify him again because he would dare to call them out for their bullshit, and so that's exactly what they don't. There's no accountability. I'm sure we'll talk about this in a little bit, but all these so-called prophets that are going around that prophesied that Donald Trump was going to win in 2020, they've all been proven wrong. Well, there's no accountability for them. They're getting away with it, you know. So what
I
about
know.
that? Nothing, not a word, because there's nobody that they have to answer to. They're not answerable to anybody except for their own followers. If they stop donating, that might hurt them.
Yeah, and it's like I tell a lot of these people, which, again, we're going to get into this a little bit deeper in episode 2. But I tell a lot of evangelicals, I say, the very Bible that you're touting, talks about this, antichrist figure that will be a politician that many will think is God
Mm,
or from God. There will be like
yep,
this cult member, and here's something like this growing right before our eyes, and
yeah, we're seeing it.
you're not even questioning that, and the response from Christians, F you, you're blind, you don't know what you're talking about, you're lost, you're brainwashed by MSN, or
Yeah,
MSM, whatever, you
lamestream
know,
media while they're
and it's
listening to Breitbart and Fox News and Alex Jones. Yep, it's true.
and it's just incredible, how blind and deaf people are. They can't even see what their
Hmm.
own religion has taught them for 2,000 years plus.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Well, and I
it's
think
absolute.
it's worth stepping back and looking at it from another perspective. There's a guy named Paul Kibble. I've had him on the show a while back, but he wrote a book about Christian hegemony. And reading his work has really kind of opened my eyes because he said, look, Christianity has been the dominant force in the world, not just in the West, for centuries. Because not only did they have control over the West in terms of the Roman Catholic Church and then the Protestant Reformation as well, but they've been a part of colonizing the rest of the world along with the European superpowers. So their impact is total across the world. So that's probably why I think in many ways they don't want to hear it because they've been so used to being in charge, really, Christianity in terms of the world and their impact on the world politically, religiously for millennia now. So they've just gotten used to being in charge. And so when you call them out on it, of course they're going to get angry.
Yeah, and whatever happened to my kingdom is not of this world, and if it
Mm,
were, my disciples would, fight to establish or defend it, but they're not, because this isn't, uh, you know, basically this isn't their home, this isn't their land. But
hmm.
here we are, all these religions conquer, kill, go to war, torture, maim, take over,
Yeah. All in the name of
I mean,
God or Allah or somebody, you know? Yeah, it's
so
true.
so so again, isn't that even like throwing a good, scalding cup of water in the face of Jesus,
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, man, we're gonna do our thing."
Yeah. Well, you turned Jesus into a political figure, and that was kind of the way it went as far as the Dominion crowd, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later, but they see him as a political figure, which is obviously not what was all about in the Gospels anyway. They kept trying to make him a king, and he resisted every effort. I don't want to be your king. I'm not here for that. So even
hmm
then, like you said, doesn't it's not consistent with at least the teachings in the gospel.
Yeah, take the last 5-8 minutes here and tell us about dominion theology. That this was something that I found uh, very disturbing in my latter years of evangelical Christianity, and one of the things that really kind of spurred me to take a second look and start that peeling away process even more. So tell the folks, I'm sure most people out there never even heard of dominion theology? What is it,
Hmm.
and what does it teach?
Well, a good place to start is to watch the series The Family on Netflix, which was from a book written by Jeff Charlotte. If nothing else, go look at that series. It's about, I think, a 6-part documentary on Netflix. That's what actually opened my eyes to this whole thing of dominion theology, because in the series The Family, Jeff Charlotte talks about this organization in Washington D.C. It's a Christian organization. It's very, very secretive. Nobody really knows members are. No one knows what they're exactly doing, but he said they follow a line of theology called dominion theology. And I thought, what is that? I've heard of a lot of theologies. I've never heard of dominion theologies. So about a year and a half ago, I started researching dominion theology, and I came across a guy. His name was R.J. Rushdoony, and he's the kind of the father of a movement called Christian Reconstructionism. And I think R.J. Rushdoony was really the first one, going back to about the 40s or early 50s, even, this goes back a long ways, to actually sort of write a systematic sort of approach to what he considered dominion theology to be. And basically, they take their mandate from Genesis 1:26 through 28, which says, it's God talking to Adam and Eve in the text of Genesis, and he says that you should rule over the earth and have dominion over it. And they say,
Hmm.
that is our mandate as Christians, that we have to rule and subdue the earth and have dominion, which is, in their understanding of it, it's a political dominion. They want to be in charge politically and religiously and educationally and on all these other areas. They think Christians should be running the show. And in some aspects of dominion theology, they believe that when Christians are in charge of everything, then Christ will return. And then it'll be this
Right.
amazing sort of millennial kingdom of 1,000 years. There's some different streams in there. Some are more charismatic than others, but that's basically, in a nutshell, kind of what the thrust is. And that's why we see, for example, in American evangelicalism, why they're so involved in the political sector with Trump, especially, because that's their aim. They're trying to take dominion, and they see it as gaining and holding on to political power.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember this is probably in the throughout the 90s, the mid to maybe the latter, when I was into the whole evangelical. I was like, dabbling in the whole word of faith
Mm-hmm.
movement, which, now they refer to more as the prosperity gospel. And that's when I first heard about it. And, basically, you know, they believe, and this is where the prosperity gospel kind of gets their jumping off point of being rich, because like you said, they're supposed to dominate the earth. They're supposed to reign. Certain
Mm-hmm.
things they do before they do X, Y, and Z, and then Jesus will return, or then the rapture will come. And they believe, as children of God, as the chosen ones, this earth and all the riches and everything in it belong to God. Therefore, it belongs to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard many evangelicals say, right now the sinners and those who are not saved are just using our resources, our riches, but in the
Mm-hmm.
end, it's all going to come to us.
Yeah, it's going to be
You know,
transferred over.
yeah. So
Yeah.
so they definitely have this world conquest mentality, which you said, leads into why the evangelicals and the fundamentalists are so steeped in government, because that's their vehicle to, world dominion,
Mm-hmm.
and then Christ will come back. And, you know, folks, when you get into that sort of thing, you see what happens. Look what happened when the Catholic Church was, conquering the world for Christ. They were hanging people upside down and
Yeah.
sawing them in half, at the crotch.
Yeah.
They
Burning
had
him at
some
the
weird
stake.
thing that, yeah, and
Oh
what was
yeah.
that weird thing they would stick up their butt and like open it up and stretch out their,
Mm-hmm.
their inside, their innards,
Oh
you
yeah.
know,
Spanish Inquisition.
yeah, this is man's way of doing things, and that's not going to change.
Yeah, it's all in
Absolute
the name of
power,
religion.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolute power corrupts absolutely, and if they have their way, this kind of thing is absolutely going to happen again. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, it's
not
a
a good
Handmaid's
thing.
Tale sort of thing. That's what a lot of people think. There's the version of what they call a theocracy, where they're ruling over society according to God's laws in the Old Testament. That's really the aim of what Christian Reconstruction is all about. That was Rushdoony's whole program, was to say that the world, certainly America, but the rest of the world should be governed by the Old Testament laws in the Bible. And so he would bring in the death penalty for homosexuality and for someone who lost their virginity before marriage and an incorrigible teen, and drag him out in the square and stone him, let the community put him to death. And that was what he was advocating. So it's not a far stretch to that vision that you just articulated, really.
No, it's definitely not.
Yeah,
You see
it's
the way that some of these people that are flocking around the Trump prophecies and this evangelical political mindset,
hmm
how violent they are, and I've seen some of them on Facebook and on Twitter. I mean, not so much now since they're really kind of limiting that kind of thing and getting rid of it. But I've seen some of these people with, their Jesus and Trump T-shirts holding the Bible, with big hand painted signs in the back that all the Democrats should be neutered and all unbelievers
hmm
should be euthanized. It's
yeah,
like, wow, it's alive and well out there. It really
it really
is.
is. Well, if people want a good resource, check out Sarah Posner's book Unholy. Why, I think it's why white evangelicals worship at the altar of Donald Trump. And she lays out in really chilling detail there's an increasing marriage between the Christian right and the alt right. So this is what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, that these two groups have increasingly been coming together. So you're seeing these sort of white supremacist militia type groups together with the Christian right, and they are starting to merge together. And the outcome, as you say, might well be violence. I mean, this election thing isn't over yet, so we don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks.
We don't. We definitely don't.
hmm
Some people think it's signed, sealed, and delivered. Biden's gonna, be the guy, but you don't know. These are
hmm
strange days indeed.
Very much so. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
there's very few people that question it. I comment on these kind of things on, YouTube and on social media, and there's maybe two or three people that will come along, Christians, and say, I agree. I'm so nervous about what's happening. How can people believe this? You
Mm.
know, and to me, I think true, good old ancient Christianity is still out there, but it's rare. It's very rare.
It's very rare. Well, there was a big sea change probably about in the late 1970s. This is something actually Jerry Falwell Sr. talked about. Of course, he was the founder or one of the founders of the moral majority around about the time of Jimmy Carter's presidency and then Ronald Reagan. And so he said something that, Christianity used to be about going out and witnessing, evangelizing to your friends, your relatives, your neighbors, trying to win them to Christ, sort of individually and get them to heaven. But he said there was a change around about the late 1970s whereby we began to realize, hey, the way to get this thing done is we need to get involved in the political sphere. That's really how we're going to take over and rule the world. It's not going to be one person at a time, telling their neighbor about Jesus. It's about getting guys installed at the very highest levels of power in Washington, D.C., and in other capitals around the world. That's where this whole thing is going. So that's really the logical outcome of Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, people like Paula White. Those people are this trajectory of what guys like Falwell were starting back in 1979. This has been going on a
Hmm.
long time. It's nothing new.
It has, and for the listener out there, we're not here, bashing Christianity or, bashing Jesus or the Bible. This show is more of a wake up call, to
Mm,
the dangers of what is happening, and those who have listened to my shows over the years, I'm a very spiritual person. I don't poo poo on anybody's belief system. But when it becomes a danger, to yourself and others, as they would say in psychology, you know, yeah, I think at least me, I feel a responsibility to speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, folks, put on the brakes here. And it's
Hmm.
very interesting just the way you worded that, getting people in these positions of power and the whole dominion theology, the takeover through government. Again, if folks out there, evangelical Christians, and you're listening to this, or maybe family members, share these next couple of podcasts with them, because it's important to think about these things. And again, I say, isn't that kind of what many call the beast system in the last days? It's the religious
Mm.
political system, and it persecutes and it kills, as the Bible says, in the last days, those who kill you will think they're doing God a service,
Hmm.
and it could fast be approaching that threshold, if these knuckleheads,
If they have
succeed
their
in
way.
their, yeah.
Well, you
So
mentioned, yeah,
be
that. Oh, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, so, be careful who you trail after, and make
Mm.
your leader and your prophet, because, it could be leading somewhere very bad in the future.
Hmm. Well, I was going to mention, you talked about these Trump reelection prophecies. This is sort of the charismatic side of dominion theology, what they call seven mountains mandate dominion theology, which is another slightly different stream, but it is related. They want Christians in charge of what they see as these seven mountains of influence across society. And these guys are twisting themselves into, backflips and knots trying to explain away why they got it wrong. Because to a person, they all confidently predicted that Trump was going to win in a landslide, even over Joe Biden. Of course, that's been proven to be false. So now they're saying, "Whoops, are we false prophets or what?" Well, it's gotten increasingly threatening, fear mongering. We have guys that are saying, we shouldn't accept the results of this election. You need to get out in the streets and meet those lefties out there that voted for Biden. So they're advocating violence now. Some of these Christian preachers are actually saying, no, we don't accept this. This is a robbery, and we're gonna rise up if necessary. So now it's crossing lines into advocating actual violence. So this is dangerous stuff. This is not just some guy ranting on a radio somewhere, a radio show. These guys have actual followers that have, AR-15s. They're part of some
Yeah.
militia group, and that's where the distinction between the alt right and the Christian right is, as I say, becoming increasingly blurred. It's all about God, guns, and Trump sort of a mentality. And these guys are
Hmm.
upset and angry, and they're about ready to grab their rifles and start. Well, we've already seen it, going out and shooting people in the streets.
I know. And that, my friend, is a great jumping off point to end episode 1 of our conversation. And when this show comes out, it will be on a Monday, probably the Monday after Thanksgiving. And stay tuned for part 2 on Wednesday, because we're going to talk about the Trump prophecies and get a little bit more into what's happening with all of this election and prophecies and all that good stuff. A lot of stuff in the old trick or treat bag to go through. So uh, thanks, Clint, for being here. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to chatting.
And everybody listening, stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time here on the Mind's Eye podcast.